everyone, and welcome to our photosynthesis lecture. I'm going to show off my nerdiness today by telling you how much I love photosynthesis and plants and how important it is to us. Alright, so photosynthesis, we're going to be getting back into thinking about chemical bonds and molecules and atoms, so all of that stuff that you learned about biochemistry will come back into play today. Photosynthesis literally means to make with light. So photo is referring to light and synthesis means to make. This is the process that some organisms like plants, algae, and some bacteria use to capture the energy of sunlight and make food. We call these organisms autotrophs. So auto means self and troph is referring to feeding. So autotrophs are organisms that can feed themselves, can make their own food, using things from the environment and don't need to eat. We, on the other hand, are heterotrophs. Hetero means other, and troph again refers to feeding or food, and so this means we have to eat other organisms. So all heterotrophs are those that need to eat other organisms in order to get their food. So autotrophs and heterotrophs need food. Autotrophs can make their own, heterotrophs can't. However, they both use food in the same ways and for the same reasons. So why do we need food? There's two basic reasons. What do we get from our food? First of all, we get energy from our food. Food contains energy. And the way it stores energy is through something called chemical bond energy. Okay? So here we have glucose. Okay? Remember, the red are oxygens, white is hydrogen, black or grayish looking is carbon. And these bonds, especially the nonpolar carbon-carbon and the carbon-hydrogen bonds, have a lot of energy in them. Okay? So the energy that is in the food that you eat is stored in something called chemical bond energy. Okay? And when those bonds are broken, they release energy. Okay? So, and that is all the process of cellular respiration, which is our next lecture. So how do we get the energy out of our food? We'll discuss that in cellular respiration. Suffice it to say right now, so the energy is extracted during cellular respiration. It makes this wonderful molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that we'll also talk about in our next lecture. And then cells use the ATP to do work. Cells can't do work with food directly. It has to be converted to ATP first. Okay? And then the cells use the ATP to drive endergonic reactions. That's just a way of saying that they use the ATP as an energy source to make reactions happen that take energy. Remember, endergonic means that a process needs an energy input in order to occur. And we've already talked about some of these. So for example, making molecules is endergonic process. So ATP is used to make new molecules. Doing active transport, which is pumping something against its concentration gradient, takes ATP or some other energy source, not always ATP, but frequently ATP. Also moving things inside the cell. Remember this guy with his big vesicle load and the motor protein, with it walking his feet down the cytoskeleton. Every step that it takes requires ATP. And there are many other things that our cells use ATP for as well. Okay? And the only way to get ATP is through food. Okay? Whether you are an autotroph or a heterotroph, you have to take the food energy, the chemical bond energy, and convert it to ATP. And we'll talk more about that during our cellular respiration lecture. Today we're going to focus on how do we get that food in the first place, and that's through the process of photosynthesis. Okay. The other thing that you get through your food are materials. So materials like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, those four atoms or elements that make up most living things, that comes to you in your food, as well as all of the trace elements that you need as well. And these, of course, are necessary for making molecules, like all those macromolecules that we learned all about, the carbohydrates, the proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Those all have carbon in them. They have nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and some other things in them as well. And the way you get that material is through taking it in from the environment or eating food. If you're an autotroph, you don't get it through eating food. You get it either from making your own food or uptaking minerals from the world through your roots. All right, so photosynthesis, like I said, is the process used by some autotrophs, not all autotrophs. There are some autotrophs that make their own food via a different pathway. But photosynthesis is a process that captures the energy in sunlight. Okay, so let's talk about this energy that's in sunlight for a couple minutes here. So the sun emits energy in a broad spectrum of electromagnetic radiation of various wavelengths. Okay, so the sun is constantly pouring energy off of it, and the energy comes in different wavelengths. Okay, and that's what this is shown here. So this is the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, there's short waves. Oops. Get rid of that. There are short waves and there are long waves. Okay, most of these we can't see. We can only see these ones here that are in the visible light spectrum. Okay. So the energy moves in waves, but is also composed of photons. Okay, and photons are discrete packets of energy. So shorter waves have more energy, and the longer waves have less energy. And that's true of the light as well. So light comes in all the rainbow colors, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. At the red spectrum, these have longer wavelengths, and so the red spectrum has longer wavelengths, so it has less energy. Down here on the blue and violet end, shorter wavelengths have higher energy. So photosynthesis is going to be absorbing this energy that's in the some of the energy that's in the visible light spectrum. All right, photosynthesis, in addition to the sun's energy, also uses carbon dioxide and water to make food. Okay, so what is this food? Well, we use food very loosely to really mean glucose. Glucose is the molecule that is created by photosynthesis. Glucose can then be used to make other molecules, or to use directly for energy. Okay. Glucose is a high energy molecule because it has a lot of carbon-carbon bonds. So this is a carbon here, and this is a carbon, and so on around the molecule, right? You guys remember that? And we're talking here about these bonds here between carbon and carbon. Carbon and carbon bonds have a lot of energy in them because, oops, that is not one, of course. So carbon-carbon bonds have a lot of energy. Remember, they are nonpolar. Okay, and that means, of course, that the electrons, draw the electrons in blue, are shared equally, right? So they're smack dab in the middle of those two atoms. They're going around as a pair, circling around this nucleus and around this nucleus equally, right? And so if you remember this, that means that there's no partial charges, right? This situation where the electrons are being shared equally means that they are both pulling on it equally. And unfortunately, I can't do a visual on this because I don't have the capability of doing that video anymore. But if you imagine a rubber band pulled taut between your two hands, that's a good analogy for these electrons that are being pulled tightly between the nucleus of one carbon and the nucleus of the other carbon. Okay, and that stores a lot of energy in it. So they're tugging on those electrons, pulling them taut, and that has a lot of potential energy in it. And that's how glucose stores its bonds, stores its energy. These bonds, like this one here between carbon and oxygen, here, or between oxygen and hydrogen, those are polar bonds, and they have some energy, but they don't have as much energy because those electrons are not pulled so tightly. All right, so before we talk about how glucose is made through photosynthesis, let's first discuss what the plant does with the glucose once it is made. Okay, so photosynthesis is going to make glucose. What do the plants do with glucose? Well, the number one thing that plants have to do with the glucose that they make is to use it in cellular respiration to make this high energy molecule called ATP, right? That we just talked about why cells need ATP. They need ATP to fund or to run endergonic processes, okay? So to make molecules, maintain concentration gradients, all that kind of stuff that cells need to do just to stay alive, okay? So it's the number one thing that we do with the food that we eat, and it's the number one thing that plants do with the food that they make. Okay, so glucose is made during photosynthesis. The first thing the plant has to do with that glucose is fulfill its basic energy needs through making ATP. Okay, if it has any extra, then it can store that glucose as starch. Okay? Remember, starch, and I know it's really small here, but remember starch is a polysaccharide, right? And it's composed of a bunch of glucose monomers, right? All of these are glucose monomers that are linked together through dehydration synthesis. You thought you got to forget that stuff, but you don't. So the way the plant makes starch is to take the glucose that's made during photosynthesis, link it together through dehydration synthesis, and make a starch molecule. That starch molecule is then stored in things called amyloplast or starch granules in things like the banana cells that we looked at when we looked at cells a long time ago at the beginning of the quarter. Remember, we stained the bananas with I2Ki or iodine, and that iodine reacted with the starch to make this nice purple color, right? And those are the starch granules, and we know it has starch in it because it's purple. Okay? So plants store extra glucose as starch so that they can use it later. So for example, a plant might store a bunch of starch in its roots or it's in its trunk if it's a tree, to be able to access it later when it wants to grow. So say, for example, it spends the whole summer doing photosynthesis, like a potato, say a potato plant. Potato plant spends the whole summer doing photosynthesis, stores a whole bunch of starch in the roots or the tubers, which are the potatoes that we eat. The next year, if nobody comes along and eats the potato plant will fund its growth in the spring using that starch that it stored up the previous summer. Of course, we like to eat starch, so we come along and eat it. But that's another thing that plants use starch for, is to entice animals to eat their fruits. So we looked at banana cells. Bananas, we like to eat them because they're sweet and because they're a good source of carbohydrates for us. They're a good source of starch for energy, right? So plants have evolved, some plants have evolved to have fruits like apples, bananas, etc. that store a lot of starch in them to entice animals to eat the fruit. And out in nature, that animal, once it ate their fruit, it would pass the seeds along and plant them as it went along. So it's a great way to disperse seeds and get them planted with a little fertilizer for the plants. Okay, so plants can use the glucose to make ATP. If they have any extra, they can store it as starch. And then the other important thing that they do with the glucose is to actually use it as a source of carbon, okay? To manufacture macromolecules for growth, reproduction, defense, etc. All of the molecules that it needs. Okay? We're going to come back and touch on this later in this lecture after we talk about the process of photosynthesis. So this is a really important thing here. Actually, they're all important, of course. All right. So first of all, let's talk about where does photosynthesis occur. So in plants and seaweeds, photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts in leaves. So remember that plants and seaweeds are eukaryotic cells. So I should have put this sooner. Here is a plant cell, be similar in a seaweed cell. Seaweed is a type of protist. That's a eukaryote. Remember, they have organelles that are chloroplasts, and that's where the photosynthesis happens. Okay? So the leaves are the main photosynthetic organism for plants. Okay? If you take a cross-section of a leaf, you'll see that it has out here these outer layers. This is called the epidermis, and on the outside of that it has this thin waxy layer called the cuticle. Okay, that helps prevent water loss through osmosis from the cells. Okay? And then onto the interior of the leaf we have all of these photosynthetic cells. So these are photosynthetic cells, and these are also, okay, these are called, you guys don't need to remember this, but in case you're interested, palisade cells and spongy mesophyll. Okay? We also have this thing here, and this is a vein. This delivers water to the cells and also takes away the sugars that are made during photosynthesis. And the xylem brings water, the phloem takes the sugars away. You don't need to remember that for this class, but just in case you're interested. And then there's also these little holes here called the stoma. The stoma are sort of like little mouths in the leaves that allow for gas exchange. And in this case, carbon dioxide will be going in because the cells will use up carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, and oxygen will go out because oxygen is made as a byproduct during photosynthesis. This is the opposite of our breathing, right? When we breathe in through our mouths, we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, and that's because of cellular respiration. Leaves need these little holes in them, these little stoma that the plant can actually control the opening and closing of because of this waxy cuticle that's preventing water loss. It also prevents oxygen from diffusing out and carbon dioxide from diffusing in, so the plant needs a little way to open it up. So that's what those are. And then if you look at the cells, they're just chock full of chloroplasts, right? Because that's the main job of these cells, is to do photosynthesis, so they need to have lots of chloroplasts. And hopefully you remember looking at the Elodea cells when we looked at them under the microscope and we saw a whole bunch of little green blobs. Those were all of the chloroplasts. Okay. Chloroplast looks like this, right? And here's the diagram, chloroplast. Chloroplast has a couple distinguishing features. First of all, they have two outer membranes, so a double membrane, and then they have on the inside this stuff called the stroma, which I know is so totally confusing because I just told you that the stoma are these little mouths, but the stroma is actually this thick fluid that's inside the chloroplast. It's kind of similar to the fluid that's inside of a cell, but it's pretty thick, and lots of biochemical reactions occur in it also. And then there are these things called the thylakoids, or the thylakoid membranes, and they're these stacks of membranes. Okay, and they're just inside the chloroplast, floating around inside the stroma, that thick fluid. It's important to understand the anatomy of the chloroplast because different parts of photosynthesis take place in different parts of the chloroplast. All right, and then just to touch on this, there are some bacteria like cyanobacteria, they're blue-green bacteria that can do photosynthesis. They don't have organelles, right, because they're bacteria, so they have the photosynthetic membranes. Those are the same thing as the thylakoid membranes, just inside their cell, okay, and so they do this whole process of photosynthesis just inside their cell. All right. So let's talk about photosynthesis. So this is the general overall chemical equation for photosynthesis. It shows us the major inputs to photosynthesis. So these are what you'd call the inputs. And the major outputs, like the things that are produced. Okay. It simplifies matters, and you definitely need to memorize this equation. But what it doesn't do is tell you all of the things that are happening in between. So we're going to break this down a little bit. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail. But let's just look at this to begin with. Okay, so let me see if I can get rid of this without accidentally going forward. Clear it off a little bit. Did it. Okay. So the inputs that go into photosynthesis, and remember these are actually really complex processes that go through many, many, many steps, but this simplifies it. So what goes into photosynthesis are 6 carbon dioxides, 6 water molecules, and light energy, so energy from the sun. Okay. So the carbon dioxide goes in through the leaf, through those stoma, and the sunlight goes in through the leaf, and water comes from the soil up the roots and into the leaf. That's if it's a plant. If it's a seaweed or a bacteria, then that cell or that organism is actually bathed in water, and the water just comes directly into the cell. Okay? So those are the inputs. The light provides the energy. Okay? This is important because photosynthesis is making something. That means it's endergonic. Okay. And it requires an energy input. Okay. And then, so sunlight provides the energy. That's the same as here. Okay. Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is important because it provides carbon, and water comes in through the soil. Okay. And then what's made is, so this says sugar here, more specifically, it's glucose. Okay, and this is what we are calling food, and that's what it's labeled here. Okay, so the food is made in the leaf, okay, and then oxygen is produced. Oxygen is produced actually from the water, and we'll talk just a little bit about that. We're not going to go into a huge amount of detail about photosynthesis, so there's a lot of stuff that's in your book that you don't need to know, so I just want you to be aware of that. As you go through this lecture and you go through the information in your book, you are required to know the extent of the information that we cover in lecture or in lab or in an in-class activity, but not the level of detail that's in your book. Okay, so let's talk about how photosynthesis works. So we can break photosynthesis down into a two-step process or 2 stages. Okay, this equation here puts those all together. Okay, so now we're going to separate it out a little bit. Okay, the first are called the photoreactions. These are also often called the light reactions. I think that's what your book calls them. This is a good name for it, either photo or light reactions, because it directly involves sunlight. So this is actually the step of photosynthesis where energy is captured. So the photoreactions are the energy capturing step, and remember that energy is coming from the sunlight. Okay. So this is a complex series of reactions that occur in the chloroplast. We're talking about eukaryotic cells here, so we'll just focus on that. On the thylakoids. Okay, so the light reactions occur here on these thylakoid membranes. Okay. And the light energy during the photoreactions is captured by this molecule called chlorophyll. Okay. Chlorophyll is a green pigment, and it is part of a larger photosystem that's embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Okay, so I know it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's the best one I could find. So these are the thylakoids from that previous slide, right? If you look up close at them, they are made of a phospholipid bilayer, as are all biological membranes. And in that are embedded these things called photosystems. Photosystems are really complex. There's photosystems 1 and photosystem 2, and you can look at them in your book if you want to. What I really want you to know is that there's chlorophyll molecules that are hanging out there. Okay, that's what these green blobs are. So the chlorophyll is important because it's going to absorb the sunlight. Okay, and this is where water is used. And oxygen is given off as a byproduct. Okay, so chlorophyll is green. The way pigments work is that they reflect the light that they don't absorb, and that's what color they are. Okay, so chlorophyll is a pigment that absorbs light in the violet-blue range, and there's actually 2 types of chlorophyll, so we'll just kind of lump them together and say that that chlorophyll absorbs violet and blue light here, and then also red light and a little orange light here. Okay? And what that means is that chlorophyll reflects back green light. Okay? So this area here where we have some yellow, green, and blue, remember yellow and green make blue, make it look green. Okay, so plants look green because of their chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is absorbing blue light, violet light, and red light, and the only light that it doesn't absorb is the green light, and so it's reflected back. This is the way all pigments work, including, say, pigments in your clothes or something. You know, so if you have a red shirt on, for example, the red shirt would be absorbing all of the colors of light except for the red. That would be reflecting it back. Things that look white are reflecting back all the colors of light. Okay, so if you put all the colors of light, you get white light. And if it's absorbing all of the light, then it's black, right? And that's why you heat up if you're wearing black in the sun, because it's absorbing all of that, not reflecting anything back. So if you're wearing a light outfit in the sun, you'll stay cooler because it's reflecting it back. Okay, so this is all you need to know for the photoreactions. Okay, so the energy of the sunlight is captured by chlorophyll. Okay, Later, that energy is going to be shuttled over to the step 2 of photosynthesis. So right now, we're just storing it, right? So the sunlight comes in, it's captured by chlorophyll, and chlorophyll, through this very complex series of reactions, temporarily stores it in a couple molecules. Okay? So at the end, we have this stored energy. The energy hasn't been made to do any work yet. It's just hanging out, being stored. It's just captured. And water is used. So in this process of chlorophyll capturing sunlight and transferring the energy to these storage molecules, water is used. It's split, and electrons from water are donated to the process, and oxygen is generated from that. Okay, so sunlight in, water in, out, we get oxygen. This is a byproduct. Okay. It happens to be a byproduct that's really important for animals, because what happens to this oxygen is it diffuses out into the air, and then we breathe it in. And so all of the oxygen that we breathe, that we need for life, we get from plants doing photosynthesis and releasing this oxygen through their stoma out into the air. Okay. And for the process of photosynthesis, the important thing here is this stored energy. Okay, so we've captured the energy from the sun and stored it temporarily in some storage molecules. And then we still need to make the glucose. So we actually haven't made anything, and that comes in the second step. Okay, so the second step are called the synthesis reactions. These are also called the Calvin cycle, named after the person who discovered how it works, or the light-independent reactions. I prefer the synthesis reactions because it's descriptive of what it does. Okay, this is the synthesizing step, meaning this is when glucose is made. Okay, so first step, we've just captured the sun's energy, stored it temporarily. Now when we go to step 2, the synthesis reactions, will actually make the glucose. So these reactions occur in this stroma, in this thick fluid that's surrounding the thylakoids. Okay, so it doesn't really look like much in this slide, right? But it's this surrounding this area of the thylakoids. Okay. And the energy that was captured during the photoreactions is going to be used to make glucose. Making glucose is an endergonic reaction. That means it requires energy input. Okay, and the way they get the energy was from the sun, right? So the sun got captured, sunlight energy got captured in the photoreactions, and now that energy is going to be used in the synthesis reactions. Okay? And that energy through the synthesis reactions, this energy that was originally in the sunlight will be stored in these carbon-carbon bonds. Remember I said that glucose is a high energy molecule. It stores energy in its carbon-carbon bonds. Where does it get that energy? Well, it gets it from the sun through the process of photosynthesis, right? So the energy goes from the sunlight, from the sun, it goes to the photoreactions, and then eventually goes to glucose. Okay, so here's what you need to know about the synthesis reactions. The energy from the photoreactions is used. Remember, that's this stored energy right here. So this is from the photoreactions. Rx and S's reactions. Okay. Carbon dioxide is used. Carbon dioxide is used because it supplies carbon, right? And this carbon here, right? So it actually takes 6 carbon dioxide molecules to make 1 glucose molecule. Okay, and so this is the glucose, right? This is produced, this was the whole point of it. Okay, and so here's all that information put together. So carbon dioxide and water go in, so right? So the water actually goes in here in the photoreactions. And the light goes in the photoreactions, and then the carbon dioxide, and the oxygen goes out in the photoreactions, then do purple. Oh, I should have done red there. Hold on. Okay, so things with a red check mark are part of the photoreactions, right? So this is photoreactions right here. Okay. And then the, let's see, the green, what the heck. And then the carbon dioxide goes into the synthesis reactions and sugars come out, or glucose comes out, right? And so this is the sugar, the synthesis reactions. Okay. And they are linked together by this stored energy. Okay. If you look at the information in the book, you'll find you'll find ATP mentioned and NADPH. These are simply storage molecules for energy that shuttle the energy from the photoreactions over to the synthesis reactions. You don't need to know those, but I just thought I'd let you know. Okay, so in the end, we have taken carbon dioxide, used the sun's energy, and made sugar. Okay, and this is actually called carbon fixation. So fixation means that when an atom is taken from the atmosphere by a living organism and it's captured or held into an organic molecule, right? So in other words, it's an organism pulling a molecule out of thin air and making it part of its body. And this is what photosynthesis is doing with carbon. Photosynthesis fixes carbon, right? It takes carbon dioxide from the air and it makes it into glucose, which is then in the plant tissue. Okay, the plant has just made an organic molecule, and then this glucose is now part of the plant and can be used for all of those things that plants need to use glucose for. Okay, this is really, really an important point, okay, because this is the only way that carbon gets into living organisms is through autotrophs doing photosynthesis. Right, so this is photosynthesis with those two-step process, right? So this is just making it one thing. So if we didn't have autotrophs doing photosynthesis, we wouldn't make any glucose, okay? And that means that we wouldn't have any food. We wouldn't have any carbon to make things out of. Okay, so remember we talked before about what the plant uses glucose for. It uses it to make ATP. So that's to run its own cellular processes, to have energy. It can store extra as starch, and then it uses the glucose as a source of carbon to manufacture all sorts of biochemicals. Okay, and so I want to look at this a little more closely. Okay, so remember, plants acquire carbon through photosynthesis. Carbon is fixed in glucose, and that glucose is used as a source of carbon to do all that stuff. Okay, so the idea is we have carbon dioxide in the air, captured in glucose in the leaves, and now the plant can take that carbon and use it to make carbohydrates. So to make cellulose and starch, it's just taking that glucose and linking it together. To make proteins, however, the glucose will first need to be taken apart, and the components, in particular we're thinking about the carbon here, will be used to make proteins. So the plant first has to make the glucose during photosynthesis, then it takes the glucose and takes it apart using some enzymes and puts it back together again, making a protein. Okay, or can do the same thing to make RNA and DNA, or to make lipids like phospholipids, fats, and oils, and then a myriad of other molecules that plants use for defense and reproduction. So plants are really amazing biochemists. They can start with glucose as their starting material that they've captured that carbon in during photosynthesis, and then take the carbon from that and get it out, break it apart and remake it into something else. So we're going to think about this, an example that most of us like, which is chocolate. Okay, so chocolate is made from the cocoa tree, okay, or the cacao tree. This is a tree that grows in the tropical rainforest, and it makes these pods in it that have beans. Okay, so both the cacao pod, where the beans are found, and the beans, along with a lot of sugar and milk, are used to make chocolate. Okay, so the cacao pod has in it primarily cocoa butter. Okay, cocoa butter is a saturated fat, right? So it has all those carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds. And then the cacao bean, I just realized there's a typo in that. I never noticed that. It should be A-O. That's funny. Has this active ingredient, the active ingredient of chocolate, which is theobromine. Okay, theobromine is the thing that's in chocolate that makes us feel happy. It's a stimulant, and it actually has a really similar structure, chemical structure to caffeine. If you notice, if you compare these, they have those same two structures. And remember, each of these corners is a carbon, right? You guys remember that? Okay. And if you look at between theobromine and caffeine, you notice that they're strikingly similar. Okay? And this means that our bodies actually react to caffeine and theobromine in similar ways. So caffeine is a stimulant, and so is theobromine. Caffeine isn't found too much in chocolate. It's mostly theobromine that's having that stimulate effect on us. From our point of view, theobromine makes us feel good, but actually from the plant's point of view, the reason why it makes theobromine is that is a poison to make it so that their seeds don't get eaten. So these cocoa beans are full of theobromine because they also have in them the embryonic plant. Okay, this is how the plant is going to reproduce itself. It makes seeds. Inside the seed has a little tiny plant that gets into the ground. It grows. It makes a new plant, right? So that's reproduction for the plant. The plant doesn't want its seeds to be eaten because then it won't reproduce, right? It would reduce its reproductive success. So it increases its reproductive success if it adds some kind of poison to the seed that doesn't harm the embryonic plant, but would harm something that ate it. Okay, and theobromine is a poison if you eat it in great quantities, or to some organisms, like dogs, it is a poison even in small quantities. So the herbivores that could possibly eat these seeds would be deterred from doing so by having that theobromine in there. A lot of the things actually that humans like as spices or things that have active ingredients that make us feel good are produced by the plant as a poison. Like actually THC in marijuana is the same thing, right? Like people use it because it makes you feel good, but it's actually a poison in great quantities, or if you're a little tiny organism. All right, but that's kind of interesting, but not quite the point. What I really wanted to focus on here is this pathway, right? So remember that the plant is going to take in carbon dioxide. It's going to get that carbon. It's going to fix it into the glucose. And then it can take that glucose and it can take it apart and use that carbon. So this carbon can use the carbons to make cocoa butter, right? So all of these carbons I'm circling once came from carbon dioxide, but came through this pathway, right? So where did the plant get all of these carbons? It got them from carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. And the same is true of theobromine, okay? Other things that are in these molecules, like oxygen and hydrogen, can be gotten through water. Nitrogen is pulled up from the soil in the roots. But the carbon, which is the backbone of all these macromolecules, is totally needed to make these structures. The only pathway to get it into the cell and available to make in other molecules is through photosynthesis. Remember, chocolate doesn't just have cocoa butter and theobromine in it. It also has lots of sugar in it, okay, and milk. Milk comes from a cow. But the sugar is made directly by a plant. Sugar is usually taken from sugar cane. There are also sugar beets that would be similar, but the idea is that the plant, the sugar cane, is doing photosynthesis, okay, capturing the glucose in the leaves, and then to make sugar, which is sucrose, so this is the same thing as table sugar. Sucrose is simply a disaccharide that has a glucose and a fructose molecule stuck together, right? It's a disaccharide. So in order to make this, it's pretty simple. The plant takes in carbon dioxide from the air, uses that carbon to make glucose. One half of a sucrose molecule is simply glucose, and the other is a simple rearrangement of glucose into fructose. Remember, these are both 6 carbon sugars. And so it's just a simple rearrangement with a kind of a one enzyme that can do that. Take glucose and put it into fructose, and it's made sugar. Okay. So chocolate has mostly plant products in it, and to that we can thank, you know, photosynthesis. And then once we take that into our bodies, we feel happy because of the theobromine, but we've also given our body energy in the form of that cocoa butter, right? So this is a saturated fat. It has lots of carbon-carbon bonds, and that means it has lots of high energy bonds, okay? Fats have a lot of calories. So 1 gram of a fat is about 9 calories. 1 gram of a sugar, like sucrose, is 4 calories, right? And that's simply because of the number of carbon-carbon bonds, right? So if you look at a fat, there's a lot of carbon-carbon bonds in these fatty acid tails. That means it stores more energy. So fats have higher energy because they have more carbon-carbon bonds. This does too, but I would say it's not a hugely significant source of energy compared to this. Okay? And then the sugar also has a lot of those carbon-carbon bonds, right? So, but fewer than the fats. So we use the energy in those bonds then to fuel our body. So, in closing, have you thanked a plant today? Plants make our food. They give us both energy and materials to sustain life, right? And this starts thinking about food web stuff that we're going to be talking about pretty soon. That carbon that goes captured through photosynthesis, stuck in the glucose, then goes to make plant biomass, right? Then we eat the plants and we use that material to give us energy and to give us materials like carbon and other types of elements to make our bodies. Or we might do it indirectly. We might eat another organism that ate that plant, right? But still, you know, this cow eats the corn. The carbon that's in this corn goes into the cow, becomes part of the cow. And then we eat the cow. That carbon that was in the cow becomes part of us. So ultimately, it all comes from the plant, right? So if we didn't have autotrophs, we would have nothing to eat and no energy to sustain life.